This is session 4 of the St. Augustine Prep Seminar, and when we left off, we were discussing the fact that Florida had become a British possession, not by the British conquering Florida per se, but because they did defeat the Spanish and the French in the French and Indian War that was fought in the northern, primarily in the northern colonies, the British colonies, and out on the frontier. And so when that war, when the French and Indian War ended in 1763, by treaty, Spain, because they lost, they were on the losing side, they were required to turn over Florida to the British, and so the British possessed it for 20 years. So St. Augustine, though, is now going to become Spanish again. That's going to change. After a 20-year time period, it's going to become Spanish again. And I'm going to tell you how that happened. The flag that you'll place on this page is the more modern Spanish flag. So you see it there on the screen. That's the one that you'll be placing and gluing in place on this page. All right, so when Florida became British in 1763, it was actually divided into two colonies called East Florida and West Florida. And so those two colonies became the 14th and the 15th English colonies. We always speak of the 13 colonies, but in fact, we had two more. The difference was that those two, East and West Florida, never participated in the Continental Congress, never signed the Declaration of Independence. They stayed loyal to the English king when the American War for Independence began. The Floridas never signed the Declaration of Independence. The capital city of East Florida was St. Augustine, and the capital of West Florida was Pensacola. Here's a map showing you how Florida was divided during that time. So you can see circled here the capital of East Florida, St. Augustine, and the capital of West Florida, Pensacola. We still don't have many people living in this colony. They are primarily living in St. Augustine and in Pensacola. During the American Revolution, the American colonists, so those in those northern 13 colonies, were fighting against who? The American colonists were fighting against England. They were fighting against the British. Now remember which countries usually fight against England. Which two just got finished fighting a war 20 years ago? Right, the Spanish and the French. The French and the Spanish. And so eventually the French and the Spanish are going to come in on the side of the American colonists in their fight against Britain. Now, because St. Augustine was loyal to the crown, loyal to England, so because Florida, the two colonies in Florida, West and East Florida, stay loyal, Florida becomes kind of a refuge for other people who are loyal to the crown, who don't want to be involved in the war, who just want to go back to being British colonies, but because there's war in their state, in Georgia or in South Carolina, we had many refugees that came down to Florida. In addition to that, St. Augustine was actually occupied by the British military, and the fort there was used as a prison for captured patriots. Interestingly, 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence were held in St. Augustine. They were first held at the fort very briefly. Then, because of their status, because they were men of influence and men of wealth, they were allowed to be paroled, meaning they could live within the walls of the city. Because they had the finances to rent a home, they had to report into the fort daily, and there were certain requirements of them, but they weren't actually held in jail cells within the fort. However, the Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina was held within the fort, really by his own choice, and I'll talk to you more about that when we're there on site. So, interesting fact though, this very old fort has a part to play in the American War for Independence, and we have 3 signers of the Declaration who are there along with the Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina. Okay, so guys, now the American War for Independence, or the American Revolution, ends. America, winner or loser? America was the winner. and she had won her independence. England was the loser. And so when they signed their agreement, that agreement was called a treaty. And this was actually the second Treaty of Paris. The first Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian War. This second treaty ends the American Revolution, the Treaty of Paris. Some of the terms of this treaty allowed America to reward the countries that had helped her. So in this treaty, England, who was the loser, was forced to give Florida back to Spain because Spain had helped the American colonists. Now remember, we have no desire at this point to take over Florida. We don't have people, it's all loyalists down here. It had always been a Spanish colony. We have no desire to control that land. And so in the treaty, England is just simply forced to give Florida back to Spain, which she does. So that is how St. Augustine became Spanish again. It's now going to be Spanish from 1784 until 1821. And by the year 1821, America was well established as a nation. And there have been some circumstances that had arisen in Florida that led to it becoming an American territory. When the Spanish came back to Florida in 1783, so at the end of the American Revolution, when they came back, they brought very few settlers with them. Remember, they'd been kicked out by the British, and the British had been there for 20 years. And a lot of the Spanish families who had been in Florida for maybe, many decades didn't return. And so now, even though Florida was Spanish again, very few of those settlers came back. There were also continual Indian raids coming across the Florida border into American-held Georgia. There weren't enough Spanish military present to control the Native American population, and the United States began to get really irritated with Spain for not stopping those violent Indian attacks. They were coming from Indian bases in Spanish-owned Florida. Also, many slaves escaped from southern masters and came down to Florida. There's actually a fort just outside St. Augustine called Fort Mose that was established as a base for escaped slaves. The problem was Florida was essentially foreign land. It was controlled by a foreign nation, Spain, and we had no right to cross the border and come down and enforce the law here. It was required that Spain do that, and they weren't doing that. So the Americans couldn't legally come into Florida to pursue the Indians or the escaped slaves. There were many complaints made to Spain. Spain did not have the manpower or the will to come and enforce the law. And so eventually, in 1821, Spain signed papers allowing Florida to become an American territory, and Spain withdrew totally. So after all those hundreds of years of Spanish influence, Spain will now withdraw entirely in 1821 from Florida, and Florida becomes an American territory. What was really popular to do at this time, America was growing by leaps and bounds. She was gaining territory to the west, and now she had gained territory to the south. And so there were people, explorers, like Lewis and Clark in 1803, much earlier, and now in the 1820s and 1830s. People were exploring these new areas and painting them and writing about them. And a very famous naturalist came to St. Augustine. He wanted to visit Florida after it became a territory. And this was an exotic place. It was so different than the rest of the colonies. This naturalist was called John James Audubon. John James Audubon. And if you've not heard of him before, his is a name that you should know. A very famous artist, and he paints, well known for painting birds and other wildlife. He visited St. Augustine in 1832, and he painted the exotic birds of subtropical Florida. One of his most famous paintings is called Greenshanks, and Greenshanks actually has the Castillo de San Marcos in the background. So just a very interesting, let's see, I think I have it here. There we go. There's Greenshanks. with the Castillo de San Marcos and St. Augustine, the town of St. Augustine, you can even see here, right here in the background. So that's really just a fun fact to know. Now let's go back here. After Florida became an American territory, in the years that followed, Americans began to pour into this new land. And the conflict with the native people got worse and worse, eventually leading to war. One of the best resistance leaders of the Native American people that lived here was named Osceola. And Osceola was a true patriot, an amazing leader. He led his people in the Seminole Wars as Americans pushed further and further into the state. Eventually in 1837, Osceola was captured. He was captured deceptively under a white flag of truce, meaning that the Americans had said that they wanted to meet with him to discuss peace. And when he came to the meeting, they captured him. So it was kind of a nasty trick. He was held in the Castillo de San Marcos, which had now been renamed Fort Marion. The Americans changed the name to Fort Marion. Some of his warriors were able to accomplish a very daring escape through a narrow window in the fort, but Osceola himself was too weak and sick to attempt the escape. Within days after, it was Coacachee and some of the other warriors, and women, in fact, that were able to escape. But within just a few days after their escape, there was really great concern among the Americans there at the fort that the Seminoles would be back to try to rescue Osceola, and so they wanted to transfer him. Although he was very weak and very sick, they did transfer him right around Christmas time. Within just a few days, he and most of the remaining captives were transferred up to South Carolina to Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor. He died there 5 weeks later, and Osceola, the great Seminole warrior of Florida, is actually buried on the grounds of Fort Moultrie in Charleston, South Carolina. In 1845, Florida finally became not just a territory, but an official state, and as such, received her flag. Let me see, did I put your flag up here? There we are. And this is the flag that you'll glue down at the top of that page. So in 1845, Florida finally becomes a state, and it was the 27th state. So what you see here is a 27-star flag. This was the legal, official United States flag at the time that Florida became a state. The next major event that's going to impact St. Augustine's history is the Civil War. The Civil War in the United States, which was fought between primarily the southern states and the northern states, the Confederates and the Union. The Confederacy were the southern states, the Union were the northern states. I want you to circle, Florida chose loyalty to the Confederacy or the Union during the Civil War. Which side did Florida choose to fight with? Oh, I didn't circle it. Well, it's the Confederacy. We chose to be a part of the Confederacy. In fact, we were either the second or the third state to secede from the United States, to withdraw and become part of a separate government called the Confederate States of America. This happens in 1861. For the first year of the Civil War, 1861, our fort was occupied by Confederate troops, by Southern troops. But by March of 1862, the fort was abandoned. Those troops had gone elsewhere. And shortly after that, the city itself was surrendered to Union troops in order to save it from destruction. So the Union came in and they actually occupied St. Augustine. They don't occupy most of the rest of Florida. And in fact, you have a lot of Confederate activity in the rest of Florida. But this port, this little harbor, and this fort were occupied, as was the city, by Union troops from March of 1862 onward. I want you to understand this is a very brief overview, but Florida's primary role in the Civil War. We are not going to have many battles. In fact, I think only one battle is fought in Florida during the Civil War, and it's called the Battle of Olustee. I think it's the only one, and it's not a prominent one. our role in the Civil War was not to supply men, although we did supply some, we do, but we're not a huge population center. And our role is not to be a battleground state. Instead, we are supplying needs of the Confederate troops. We do supply troops, 16,000 fight in the conflict. We supply food, pork, cattle, and I've put cattle in all capital letters because at this time, Florida and Texas were the two primary sources for cattle, for having meat to feed your troops, and both Florida and Texas were part of the Confederacy. And so driving those cattle northward to supply the hungry Confederate troops was one of the primary roles of Florida in the Civil War. We also supplied molasses, sugar, and salt. Salt is going to be very important during the Civil War. Salt is used to, what's the word? To cure meat. It's used to preserve. It's used to preserve meat. And so salt production becomes a huge industry during the Civil War. And in fact, the next person that we're going to talk about, or not the next, but my next little section, we're going to talk about what, his investment in salt. And salt was really a huge influence during the Civil War. Okay, so troops from Florida, food from Florida, and finally ports. We had ports all along our coast that were able to provide safe harbor for Confederate ships. One young man from St. Augustine would rise to fame during the war, and he would actually participate in many important battles to defend the Confederacy. So this is a young guy born and raised in St. Augustine. His family was from St. Augustine, and his name was General Edmund Kirby Smith. Edmund Kirby Smith. He was one of the most trusted generals serving under Robert E. Lee. He fought in the Battle of Bull Run along with many others, so he was there serving with Stonewall Jackson and many of the very famous Joe Johnson members of the Confederate Army. His mother remained here in St. Augustine during the war until 1862, when the Union troops came in and occupied the city. She kind of, made sure that she and her friends were in the right places at the right time, listening to conversations, etc. And she would gather up any information she could on what the Union was doing and then smuggle messages out on ships to her son while she was discovered. And they very kindly, I suppose, did not punish her except to say that she could not live in the city anymore. And so she was banished from St. Augustine in 1862. This is what General Kirby, or Edmund Kirby Smith, looked like during the Civil War. So here he is on the right. And then this is a very famous print of Robert E. Lee and his generals. And Edmund Kirby Smith is pictured right down here at the bottom. I know this isn't in your notes, but I just want you to see what an important person he was during the Civil War. And also this image here, this statue that you see, in the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., every state is allowed to contribute 2 statues to the Capitol, only 2. So there are 100 of these statues scattered throughout the Capitol building. And Florida's 2 statues, one of them is of this General Edmund Kirby Smith of St. Augustine, and the other is of a man that invented air conditioning. And that's probably pretty appropriate. I don't think Florida would have been ever a very populous state if not for the invention of air conditioning. So General Edmund Kirby Smith is our highlighted figure from the Civil War period. And then St. Augustine will further develop after the Civil War. It stays a pretty quiet town, and quite frankly, Florida stays a pretty quiet place until the very late 1800s. In the 1870s to early 1890s, we have another industrial revolution here in America as manufacturing really takes off. Big business grows, many inventions come along that make life easier for everybody, not just for the wealthy. But people are becoming, and especially a very small portion of society is becoming very, very wealthy, beyond all belief. This time period, Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. So Mark Twain calls that late 1800s period, 1880s, 1890s, he calls it the Gilded Age. If something is gilded, then it's gold on the outside, but it's not solid gold. It's just painted. It has just a very thin layer of gold on the outside to make it look like it's gold. But on the inside, it's usually some cheap material like clay or bronze or something, and then it's covered in this gold. Well, Mark Twain called this the Gilded Age because that's exactly how he saw our culture. He said things looked beautiful on the outside, but Americans culturally were drifting away from their foundations, from their real trust in God, from their core values. They were beginning to think that their wealth and their power was from their own strength, not a result of the blessing of God. Essentially, our core was rotting away, but on the outside we looked beautiful. We looked wealthy. We were prospering, but we were forgetting the source of that blessing. So the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age will impact St. Augustine in a powerful way. During this time, St. Augustine was just kind of a stop-off. Nobody stayed here. There were just one or two little dinky hotels. It was a stop-off for wealthy northern visitors who were maybe on their way to other beach cities further south. In fact, even those beach cities really hadn't been developed very much, so often it was just people perhaps from Savannah, Georgia, that would make a little trip down to see this quaint fort. They could take the railroad as far south as St. Augustine and see the fort there. Well, a rich oil investor, a man who had become an investor in a company called Standard Oil. And I know parents may recognize that. Students, that's a name you should know. But Standard Oil was the company of a man named John D. Rockefeller, and his business partner was Henry Flagler. So John D. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler had this oil company, and it had made many, many multiple millions of dollars. They were very, very, very wealthy men. Henry Flagler had a wife who was not well, and so he and his wife visited Florida thinking that it might help her health. A lot of doctors prescribed that at the time when the North was, during wintertime when it was so bitter and difficult weather to live in, they would send people to the South. And so he visited Florida thinking that it might help his wife's health. And while he was here, decided that it would make a wonderful tourist destination. And I'm abbreviating the story a little bit. His first trip here was really not a success. It was his second trip that convinced him that perhaps his first trip he really wasn't much impressed with St. Augustine. But by the second trip, he had a kind of a different frame of mind and decided that this could indeed be a wonderful tourist destination. And he took this on as his project. And I really can't overstate the influence of Henry Flagler on the East Coast and a man named Henry Plant on the West Coast. But we're going to focus on Henry Flagler and his development of the East Coast of Florida. This man is largely responsible for the creation of Florida as we know it today. He invested millions of dollars to connect and extend a railroad in Florida. This man builds a railroad all the way down the east coast of Florida called the Florida East Coast Railroad. Then he built a bridge for the railroad so that it could go all the way to Key West. And again, y'all, I want you to understand that at that time, the technology to be able to pour cement that would harden below water, in the water, was cutting edge. I mean, this man invested millions and millions of his own dollars to complete this project, and it really was the equivalent of sending a man to the moon. It was that difficult an undertaking, and it took many years, but he is successful in the end in connecting or building this bridge that connected the southernmost point of Florida all the way down to Key West. He also spent millions building hotels and developing resort areas. As his railroad came down the East Coast, he built hotels in several cities along the way. West Palm Beach and Miami included. Miami was nothing. It was absolutely nothing before Flagler extended his hotel, or extended his railroad through the city and built a hotel there. One of his most famous hotels, and the first, in fact, was the Ponce de Leon Hotel. You probably could have guessed, but appropriately he built the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine. Today, that hotel operates as a college. So today it's called Flagler College, but we will visit it while we're there. We will be able to go inside and understand how it might have looked when it was in its heyday at the turn of the century, in the late 1890s and early 1900s, and when all the most famous luminaries of America visited there. Thomas Edison and presidents and all kinds of very famous people came and stayed in this hotel. So you'll visit it while we're there. He built another hotel just across the street, featuring, it was the less formal hotel. It had all of the entertainment there across the street. It had spa treatments. It had the largest indoor pool in America at the time. So it was a luxury hotel, but it was less formal. And that hotel across the street was called the Alcazar. Within just a few months, a friend of his that actually gave him the idea for how to construct his hotel, but that gentleman had been building his own hotel on the same little plaza. So there were literally going to be 3 of these grand hotels right on the same town square, basically. Well, within just a few months, the friend realized that he was not cut out for the hotel business, and he was in dire financial straits, and he sold it to Henry Flagler. So Henry Flagler wound up owning 3 hotels, all on the same piece of property, essentially. And that third hotel was called the Casa Monica. If any of you have played Monopoly, this is where we get the idea that this is where the idea for Monopoly came from. Were these very wealthy men who were building railroads and who were buying property and who were putting hotels on that property. So Henry Morrison Flagler was a kingpin, and here we see a prime example of him purchasing this piece of property and having 3 hotels all sitting there on this piece of property, and connecting his hotels to the north were his own railroads. I want to show you a brief little video clip that will help you perhaps understand a little bit about Henry Flagler and his accomplishment.
On January 22nd, 1912, Henry Morrison Flagler fulfilled a dream he'd been pursuing for decades. He rode his own iron into Key West. Flagler was 82 years old and almost blind, but he had made it. Henry Flagler was used to the world taking notice of his accomplishments, but even he was overcome by the greeting he received when his private rail car pulled into the station at Key West that morning. There were businessmen and politicians from across the state, foreign dignitaries from throughout the Caribbean and Latin America, and more than 10,000 people from the island, all on hand to cheer Flagler and his first train from the mainland. The old man was truly touched. In speeches and at celebrations that lasted a week, he was praised to the skies. He alone had done what no one else had been able to do. He'd taken on America's last frontier and pushed it back as far as you could go. It's now been a century since Henry Flagler linked the state of Florida end to end with his railroad and chain of luxury hotels. What was then, in many places, waterlogged, bug-infested wilderness is now home to 19 million people, most of whom live in cities and towns that didn't even exist when Flagler was alive. The story of the century Flagler launched is the story of this stunning transformation. During this time, no state in the country changed more quickly, more dramatically, or came to symbolize the American dream in the way Florida did. And now, 100 years down the line, it's a story that has all of a sudden taken a turn in an uncertain direction.
We'll pick up in our next session with a discussion of some of the symbols and architecture of St. Augustine.